its total carbon budget. That means we should be carbon zero now or within the next few years, certainly by the end of this decade. So the idea of 82% by 2050 is way outside the scientific realm, and these are political decisions. So this is something that the CCC, the committee, has pretty much said themselves. So, for example, they've said that there is no technical reason why Northern Ireland can't be net zero. So if it's not a technical reason, what is it? These are structural issues, these are political issues, these are economic issues. They're not scientific issues. Lord Deben himself, when given evidence to the committee, did caveat the assertion that Northern Ireland can't be zero carbon by 2050 by saying, under the current circumstances. So again, what are those current circumstances? It's our economic model, it's our political structures, it's our infrastructure, it's our structural barriers. So it's not, again, a scientific question, it's a political question. And the Northern Ireland Assembly has the authority and has the competency to deal with those political, economic, structural obstacles. And all it takes is leadership, really, we would argue. The CCC has said that there is an advantage to a net zero target, and that is that other sectors won't be lobbying for the, kind of the difference. When they were comparing the 80% target of the UK Climate Act, they were saying, other sectors aren't going to be lobbying for that spur 20%. And again, it's the same here. Sectors won't then be lobbying for a disproportionate cut of that 18% shortfall. So we would argue then that these are political decisions, not scientific decisions, and that it is within the remit of the Assembly, the competency of the Assembly, to deal with those issues. So moving on then to the notion of fair share. Again, the Minister would say that this is a fair bill, and it's dealing with Northern Ireland's fair share contribution to the UK's target. Now, we've already covered what we think are the failings of the CCC's advice, the assumptions and the parameters within which it is operating. I won't reiterate those. It's all in our previous submission. But as I said before, we are emitting 10 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year. So let's put that into perspective in order to get a fair share idea. The UK average is about 6.8 tonnes of CO2 equivalent a year. China's emissions are about 7.1 tonnes of CO2 a year. Bangladesh produces about 1.23 tonnes of CO2 a year. And Kiribati, a small South Pacific island state, produces about 0.95 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year. So our 10 tonnes, in perspective, is way above a fair share equivalent or a fair share proportion. So let's look a little bit about the scientific impacts, what we know from the science about the impacts of climate change. So a 1 metre sea level rise, for example, would negatively impact or completely flood about a third of Bangladesh, affecting about 35 million people. So let's again just recap. Bangladesh's emissions are about 1.23 tonnes of CO2 a year. For Kiribati, for example, they are already seeing their drinking water being contaminated by seawater, and they're already making drastic plans to evacuate the entire nation, or drastically again to raise it even higher. Now, how do you raise a small island atoll is beyond me. So these are the impacts that we're seeing from other nations whose contribution to the problem is minor compared with ours. Ours are 10 times what is being produced by these nations that are seeing the biggest impact. So not only is Northern Ireland producing way above its global fair share, it's also producing more than the UK fair share. So the argument that this is our fair share contribution, I think, falls short. The UK emissions fell by about 44% since 1990. Ours have fallen by 18% over the same period. So we're not pulling our weight here. And the UK ranks 124th out of 180 nations as far as its emissions go. Northern Ireland's emissions being higher by the UK average, we can then assume that ours would be, or we would rank even lower. So clearly, this 82% is not a fair share contribution. We are already producing way above our fair share. And so we have to ask the question, are the people of Northern Ireland do more of the atmosphere than the people in England, Scotland and Wales, or the people in Bangladesh or China or Kiribati? And I think the answer to that is clearly no. We don't deserve more of the atmosphere than other people around the world. So why should we be allowed to produce more emissions than other people around the world? So we'll move on then to agricultural emissions. So greenhouse gases from agriculture account for about 26% of Northern Ireland's total, and they are rising, and they've risen by about 8% since 1990. So clearly agriculture isn't doing enough here. Now, the principal component of agricultural emissions is methane, which in the short term is about 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide. But it is relatively short-lived. And those two elements there of being very potent and short-lived are absolutely crucial. Agricultural emissions will inevitably have a long tail. It's just the nature of agriculture. Emissions from the land, emissions from livestock will mean that there's a long tail. So when you factor in a long tail and the potency and short-term effect of methane, what that means is we have to front load agricultural emissions rather than allow agriculture to continue on a relatively business as usual model. What we should be doing is front loading the reduction in agricultural emissions rather than pushing back reductions in agricultural emissions to some later date. Now, according to the Global Methane Assessment from the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, cutting methane will have not only positive impacts for climate change, but also health impacts and productivity impacts. And you can reference that particular report. There's a link to it in my paper. So agriculture is not only an emissions problem for the climate, it's also a pollution problem and a human health problem. So tackling methane emissions and tackling agricultural emissions have positive impacts across the board. So we should sign up to the Global Methane Project to cut methane emissions by about 30% by 2030. That would be kind of a separate issue, but it could be incorporated in here. We should also include nitrogen budgets. We have carbon budgets in the bill, but we should be including nitrogen budgets because they're not being properly included. Nitrogen and ammonia and various oxides of nitrogen have both human health and pollution impacts, and they should be considered. So just to wrap up, we think that more needs to be done in this particular bill, that the decisions aren't scientific decisions, but are political decisions, that Northern Ireland has already done less than its fair share, and arguing from a kind of a special case that we are already behind, therefore we should be allowed to continue to be behind, just is a non-starter. Northern Ireland is already a climate laggard, and we can't allow us to continue to be a climate laggard. We need to catch up, and therefore we need to do more than this bill allows for. So we'll maybe leave it there.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Declan. We'll move on to the next speaker then, Nick. Yeah. We'll start here. Right. Okay. Then we'll hear from Jade. Jade.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Jade.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I want to start by saying thank you for having me here today and taking this time to scrutinise this bill and taking the time to listen today. So I'm going to focus on adaptation and reducing climate risk with a bit of a sprinkle of the amendments as well in mentioning them. Okay, so we are in a climate crisis, and Northern Ireland is already feeling the impacts of the baked-in climate change because we had record temperatures during August, and not just August. September was the warmest joint month on record for Northern Ireland. The climate crisis is not just an environmental problem, it impacts on us economically, socially, our health, and every aspect of our future, which means it's up to all of us to treat it like an emergency across all departments, the public and private sector, and civil society. So climate legislation provides us with the skeleton to hang all the supporting policy and action upon. We need a strong skeleton, and we need the legislation to be ambitious and brave, as we have an opportunity here to be a leader. There is a need to strengthen the language within the bill, beginning with turning the mays to wills, to strengthen those joints and add muscle by adding amendments such as a just transition, nitrogen budget similar to Scottish legislation, and nature-based solutions similar to the Republic of Ireland, as well as clear non-regression principle within the bill. There needs to be an equal weighting of adaptation, as it is vital for Northern Ireland to be climate ready, and currently we are simply not. We're exposed to multiple climate risks according to the most recent independent climate risk assessment, and we're not investing enough time and research into any potential opportunities either. Adaptation should be mainstreamed across all sections of society and is fundamentally place-based. Local authorities and communities have a critical role to play in developing community resilience. Adapting to climate change is a whole of government challenge, requiring a collaborative, joined-up approach, and this should be reflected in legislation. Adaptation reporting power should be mandatory for public bodies after a co-design process rather than it being imposed, as well as reporting from all governmental departments and arm's length bodies, and voluntary reporting with support for civil society so that we can have this net zero resilient future. Uganda have just published their Climate Act in September. I'm not suggesting that we go and copy every aspect of that, but they've reflected on the need to consider climate in a more holistic fashion and have legislated to having regard for available scientific and indigenous knowledge on climate change, the specific resilience and adaptation needs of the vulnerable and marginalised communities, gender and human rights issues, food security, sustainable development, loss and damage by climate change on ecosystem communities and humankind. And also they've included integration of climate change into the national curriculum and financing and incentives for climate action. There are things there we could learn from Uganda, and they have not just plucked these things from thin air, they've taken them from the Paris Agreement. So Article 7 in the Paris Agreement, Section 4, parties recognise the current need for adaptation is significant and that greater levels of mitigation can reduce the need for additional adaptation efforts, and the greater adaptation needs can involve greater adaptation costs. Section 5 covers parties acknowledge that adaptation action should follow a country-driven, gender-responsive, participatory and fully transparent approach, taking into consideration vulnerable groups, communities and ecosystems, and should be based on and guided by the best available science and, as appropriate, traditional knowledge of additional Indigenous peoples and local knowledge systems, with a view to integrating adaptation into relevant social, economic and environmental policies and actions. This should be included in the climate bill. It comes from the Paris Agreement. You know, the UK has signed up for it, so has the Republic of Ireland, so has the EU and 197 countries around the world. The UK government have stated just in the last few days in their response to the CCC's independent review of the UK's progress on adaptation that policies supporting net zero should be made resilient to current and future climate change risks to prevent locking in future vulnerabilities, unintended consequences and maladaptation. We are here to help you make those amendments to take this from being a bill to being an ambitious act that we need for the future.
Okay. Thank you, Jade. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to move over to Jonathan Bell. Jonathan.
Yep. Good afternoon, Chair, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation this afternoon. We really welcome the opportunity to offer our views on Climate Bill number 2. And we're delighted to see the committee taking such a focus on climate change. I'm going to start by just giving a brief overview of some of the key points we want to raise, and then Daithi's going to finish off and conclude the presentation. So in our evidence submission, we raised a number of fundamental issues with the Climate Bill number 2. In short, we feel the bill is not ambitious enough. It does not reflect the urgency of the situation, and there are a number of weaknesses in the bill. There's a major oversight in the bill in terms of the lack of mention of biodiversity, nature or nature-based solutions, and I'll come back to that in a moment or two. But firstly, some other issues to mention. Firstly, we feel that the 82% target is not ambitious enough. the 6th assessment report by the IPCC issued a code red for humanity. In this context, we feel the executive should be aiming for a net zero bill at the very least. Every legislator around the world should be doing their utmost to ensure that preventing nature and climate breakdown is their top priority, and the Northern Ireland executive is no exception. Secondly, clauses 4 and 5 give substantial power to the department to change the emissions targets year's baseline. We see no reason why the department should be allowed to revise targets down in the future. The bill should be amended to ensure targets can only be revised upwards, i.e. become more ambitious. Thirdly, the bill number 2, as drafted, does not set out adequate governance arrangements. We know environmental governance is historically weak in Northern Ireland. We simply cannot afford to repeat these governance flaws in a climate context. To ensure robust scrutiny of how we are delivering on our climate ambitions, Northern Ireland climate legislation should include provisions to establish a climate office with a climate commissioner. Fourthly, the bill is not underpinned by just transition principles. We can't just assume a just transition. It needs to be explicit in the legislation, and a just transition principle would help to reduce the human and economic costs of climate disruption. And finally, what I want to major on now is the lack of mention of nature, nature-based solutions or biodiversity within the bill, which we feel is a major oversight. The IPCC and the IPBS are united in their view that climate change and biodiversity are interconnected and that neither can be addressed without effectively addressing the other. Now, a report recently published by the joint statutory agencies, which included NIEL, called Nature Positive 2030, states, "We need to go high nature and low carbon, tackling the twin crisis of biodiversity loss and climate change together. The crisis of biodiversity loss and climate change share many of the same causes and solutions. We need to tackle both crises or we will tackle neither." That was a direct quote from the report. Well, there's no better way, in my view, and in the view of RSPB, to achieve this supposed ambition than to integrate these two factors through the legislation. Therefore, in our view, Climate Change Bill number 2 should be amended in two fundamental ways. First, the inclusion of a biodiversity duty to take account of and mitigate the likely impact of targets or carbon targets on the conservation and enhancement of biodiversity. The rationale for this is that there is a risk that deployment of actions to reduce emissions and adapt to climate change may worsen the existing drivers of biodiversity loss, and a similar duty is enshrined in the Scottish climate legislation. And secondly, a nature-based solutions clause that emphasises the importance of high-quality nature-based solutions to address the climate and nature crisis should be incorporated. And the rationale for this is that we need more than passive benefits to biodiversity from climate change action to ensure that we maximise the contribution of biodiversity to climate change mitigation and adaptation. Active protection and restoration of biodiversity is a nature-based solution. If done well, it reduces emissions of greenhouse gases, it enables carbon capture and storage, and enhances the resilience to disruptive effects of climate change on land and sea. Now, given the growing awareness of the vital role of nature-based solutions to climate change, specific provisions have been incorporated into the Republic of Ireland's Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act 2021, and the clause in that legislation reads, "To support nature-based projects that enhance biodiversity and seek to reduce or increase the removal of greenhouse gases or support climate resilience in the state." And again, it says enhance biodiversity.
He's out here, Jonathan.
Sorry? Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay, Declan?
Chair, suggest Jonathan check the law back in again.
Jonathan, our IT person is suggesting that you maybe try to log out and log back in again because you're frozen here on our screen.
Okay. Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, still frozen. You're intermittent, Jonathan.
Okay.
Could Daithi pick up until you log back in again, perhaps, or something like that, Jonathan? Now we're picking up that other members can hear you okay. The problem might be in the building. The problem might be in the building here now. It might be. We're all frozen now, so
We're all frozen on.
I've nothing happened here.
You're back now.
Hello? Daithi, can you see and hear me okay?
Can Declan, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Do you wanna continue there? Sorry, we're having troubles here on the side, so are.
No problem at all. So just to conclude, we feel that the bill is greatly lacking in urgency and ambition both. As previous speakers have said, there's almost universal recognition now that we're living in a nature and climate emergency, that our climate is breaking down, and these islands statistically are some of the worst in the world in terms of nature loss. So in terms of considering this bill, the question for us is, does the Climate Change 2 bill appear to rise to that challenge or not? We would argue that as presented, it does not. The amount of potential get-out clauses and holes and aspects of the bill is a concern. There are positive aspects to it as well that we recognise, but overall the emissions reduction target is a major concern. Because if you look at the other assemblies and parliaments, Edinburgh has a net zero target, Cardiff has a net zero target, Dublin has a net zero target now as well. So we would be very concerned that we would be setting a very poor example and be seen as the climate laggard of these islands if we don't set a net zero target as the bare minimum, really, of a climate change act. So as Jonathan has said, we urge the committee in terms of this piece of legislation to do two things of interest to RSPB. One, accept in principle the need for a biodiversity duty, and two, ensure a nature-based solutions clause is explicitly included in climate change legislation, as has been the case in the South. And finally, Chair, I think there's also worth saying that there's a great opportunity for our committee members to consult further with members of the public, and I think especially in terms of young members of the community. In 2 weeks' time, on Saturday the 6th of November, there will be major rallies taking place in both Belfast and Derry, and of course that's to coincide with the COP26 events in Glasgow, the conference. But a central theme for these rallies in Belfast and Derry is going to be the need for a strong, ambitious climate change act to be passed by the Assembly. And certainly from RSPB's position, our position is that we should aim for net zero for 2045. But I have to say, obviously the CCC produced its report. Since then, however, we've heard from the IPCC, and after that report was released, and it doesn't look like things are getting any better. That's sure to be said. But the reaction we're getting from young people, especially, is that they don't believe that even 2045 may be enough. So I think there's a rise in climate anxiety among young people, because they can do the numbers. They look at the statistics and the probabilities and possibilities based on the science, and they see that their chances of having a future of decent standards, a decent quality of life, and they actually see the threat that climate change poses to the economy. If we go on as we are doing, if industries continue to set their face against science, and if we do things really slowly rather than fast, then there will be no economy comparable to what we have today internationally and locally. and also that will detrimentally affect many, many industries, especially agriculture, it has to be said. So there's a real need for us to put our long heads on here as well. The short-term impacts, we may not see it that greatly on a local level, although arguably we do. But over the next coming decades, we're really facing into a quite dangerous situation. So we really need to see leadership from the Assembly in regard to this issue.
Thank you, Daithi. Okay, we're going to move over to Malachy from the NIEL.
Thank you, Chair. The first thing I think I should do is just to check that everybody can hear me okay.
Yes, Malachy.
That's great, thank you. I would like to just thank the committee for inviting Northern Ireland Environment Link, or NIEL, to give evidence on the Climate Change No. 2 bill today. I would invite you to cast your minds back to the exceptionally hot July of 2021. On the 17th of July, a temperature of 31.2 degrees centigrade was recorded in Ballywaddecock near Newtownards, and this was hotter than Northern Ireland's previous record temperature of 30.8 degrees. On the 21st of July, 31.3 degrees was recorded at Castlederg, and the following day, 31.4 was recorded at Armagh, though this was not ratified as an official record. According to the Met Office, the average July temperature in Northern Ireland is around 18 to 19 degrees. In July 2021, there were 12 days above 20 degrees, 3 of which were above 31 degrees, more than 12 degrees above the average, and 8 Northern Ireland weather stations recorded their highest average July temperature. Now, if anyone is not sure what summer temperatures up to 12 degrees above the average could mean, the wildfires that raged in Greece in July, where temperatures were up to 8 degrees above the average for the time of year, provide a frightening indication of what the answer might be. And we must remember that this is actually relevant to Northern Ireland, because according to the Northern Ireland Fire and Rescue Service, there were more than 1,000 wildfires in the Mournes between the 1st of April 2016 and the 31st of March 2020. And that therefore does not include the major wildfire on Slieve Donard in April this year. Now, despite this record-breaking heat, according to the Met Office, the mean temperature for July 2021 in Northern Ireland was approximately 1.9 degrees centigrade above average. Now, if you think about how hot July 2021 was compared to other years here, I think that will help convey that extremes can be hidden behind averages and what the Paris Agreement's targets really mean. However, climate change poses many other threats, as illustrated by the catastrophic floods in Western Germany, Belgium and the Netherlands in August this year, which caused the deaths of 242 people and economic losses of over 10 billion euros. We also need to consider the issues of climate justice and growing inequality, which have been referred to by earlier speakers. And this is illustrated by the World Bank, which said in its Climate Change Action Plan 2021 to 25, left unchecked, climate change will push 130 million people into poverty over the next decade. The World Bank also said in that report, we must go beyond just green projects to support the greening of entire economies. In 2020, global average temperatures were around 1.2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial average. And since 1981, the annual global temperature has increased at an average rate of 0.18 degrees centigrade per decade. And so, as the IPCC concluded in a sixth assessment report, it is more likely than not that the world will reach the 1.5 degree threshold sometime between 2021 and 2040. As the UN Secretary General said in the UN State of the Global Climate 2020 report, time is fast running out to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. We need to do more and faster now. The evidence suggests that the public is very much in favour of this, and that they share that view, and especially our young people. And I would therefore urge all MLAs to support an appropriately ambitious climate change bill for Northern Ireland, which has, as a minimum, the following 4 components. Firstly, a net zero target for greenhouse gas emissions, preferably by 2045 or earlier, but no later than 2050. Second, a requirement for climate action plans and carbon budgets for all sectors. Third, a mechanism for independent Northern Ireland-based scrutiny through a Climate Office and Climate Commissioner. And fourth, provision for a just transition to help support sectors to move to net zero. Unfortunately, the Climate Change No. 2 bill does not have all of these components. Furthermore, not only do the bill's targets for 2040 and 2050 fall short of what Neal believes Northern Ireland needs to achieve, but paragraph 4.1 in part 1 of the bill gives the department the authority to change the targets both in terms of the level of emissions reductions and the date by which those are to be achieved. In effect, the bill's targets are not fixed. For this and other reasons, Neal does not support the Climate Change No. 2 bill. I would just like to finish by highlighting some of what the Climate Change Committee has said about the risks of inaction and climate change. I'll just read some quotes, and these are from the Climate Change Committee letter to the ERA Minister dated the 1st of April. The committee said, long-term decarbonisation can also bring substantial co-benefits, particularly for the natural environment, climate change adaptation and public health. The greatest risks are associated with failing to act quickly enough. The committee also said a failure to act decisively could have distributional impacts if the rest of the UK accelerates action, with Northern Ireland missing out on the growth and job creation benefits of a low carbon investment. And finally, the committee also said that business models that are not compatible with a net zero future are increasingly risky. Now, all of those quotes are taken directly from that letter to the Minister on page 8. I would remind the committee, though, that the ERA Minister has said in the foreword to the DAERA Climate Change Bill discussion document earlier this year, tackling climate change should be viewed not just as an environmental challenge, but also as an economic opportunity. Neal believes that Northern Ireland should make the most of those opportunities. So I would urge our political representatives to take appropriately ambitious action and to do so with positivity and optimism, confident that that is the right thing to do. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Malachy. Thank you. And we're going to ask Heather now to Heather McLachlan of the National Trust.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay, just to check that?
Yes, Heather.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to provide evidence for the Climate Change No. 2 bill today. As a conservation charity, the National Trust's primary role is looking after and providing access to some of Northern Ireland's most special natural built and cultural heritage assets. In Northern Ireland, we look after 46 square miles of countryside and manage 108 miles of the coastline. That's 22% of the coastline. So tackling climate change is one of our key goals as an organisation, with our own net zero target to be reached by 2030. So this really matters to us. To be effective, we believe Northern Ireland's climate change legislation should therefore include 4 key elements. Firstly, ambitious targets. Northern Ireland needs to reach net zero as soon as possible. The bill follows the CCC's recommendation to reduce all greenhouse gases by at least 82% by 2050. This is the absolute minimum target we should have. We would like to see a more ambitious target, and one that we think is achievable, but it only can do that if we have the right policy and funding interventions in place. Secondly, appropriate milestones are needed, including 5-year carbon budgets. We very much welcome the 5-year carbon budgets and interim targets in the bill, and to set a cap on emissions and measure progress towards the target. However, they should be strengthened further, we believe. Unused emissions should not be allowed to be carried forward to the next carbon budget. We also believe a requirement for detailed climate action plans should be included to ensure that the implementation of this policy and the policy decisions will drive progress forward. Thirdly, an independent reporting and reviewing mechanism is required. We believe a separate independent reporting and reviewing body should be established in the Northern Ireland to champion climate action and report on the effectiveness of any climate change legislation and the plans being implemented. Finally, and most importantly, the principle of non-regression. We are concerned by the provisions in the bill that allow changes to the targets without suitable limits on how this should be should be used. A non-regression clause must be added to the bill. If new evidence indicates emissions could be reduced more quickly, the target should be able to be strengthened accordingly. However, the bill must not be allowed to be amended to slow down Northern Ireland's progress towards net zero. More broadly, we want to ensure that the legislation provides a framework for the action that follows. Further amendments should be made to drive action in two key areas, and I want to pass over to my colleagues Victoria and Sophie, who will go through those briefly. So one is adaptation and the other is nature-based solutions. Victoria.
Hi, members, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep, we're good. Thank you for having us today. So I'm going to do about 2 minutes on climate adaptation and on coast. So given how much Coast and Countryside National Trust looks after, we're particularly interested in this area of how we plan to adapt to live with climate change risks. So we welcome that the bill in its current form makes provisions for the department to engage with the existing adaptation reporting power. That's a good thing. However, reporting is not enough. So to embed the scale of transformation that is needed, we believe we need to go further than just the reporting powers. Reporting powers have been in place for some time now, yet the most recent assessment of climate change risk paints a bleak picture of inadequate action and missing knowledge in our devolved setting. So the most recent CCRA, CCR3, it says that adaptation at governmental level in all administrations is not occurring at a speed and scale to match the climate change risk, both present and future. And priority habitats and species continue to be lost and ecosystem services degraded. So that's not a good picture. Moving on then, just in terms of what we do have in place, the Northern Ireland Climate Change Adaptation Plan, it does set out priorities for urgent adaptation over 5 years. We believe that actually good piece of work, but actually having strategies and delivery plans will only go so far without having legislative underpinning, and that's what's needed. So we would ask the committee to consider how best to set a legal duty for government bodies and departments to monitor and assess the relevant climate risks, and then to embed adaptation into climate action plans. And then I'm just going to cover very quickly a bit on coast. So in Northern Ireland, National Trust has been really vocal about the need for new policy, a policy guide to coastal erosion risk management planning. It's estimated that 19.5% of Northern Ireland's coastline is either eroding or at risk of erosion. So we require policies to allow government, communities and businesses to adapt, work with the forces of nature and prepare for the future climate scenarios in which we'll live. So Northern Ireland currently lacks historical coastal change data and baselines to monitor the impacts of this erosion. We live on an island and the sea level is rising. In considering adaptation, the committee should consider if, as part of our adaptation response, a legal responsibility to establish a Northern Ireland Coastal Observatory could be put into the bill. So a coastal observatory would monitor and advise on rates of coastal change, the effects of storms and seasonal behaviour at the coast. And in other jurisdictions, what coastal observatories do is they enable understanding of climate risk at the coast, and they allow for informed adaptation by coastal economies, communities and the natural environment. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Sophie, who's going to talk a bit about nature-based solutions.
Hello, Sophie. Can you?
I can hear you.
Yeah, go ahead, Sophie. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Right. So as part of the National Trust's commitment to achieving net zero emissions by 2030, we've got ambitious plans to capture more carbon in the land we look after, and whilst restoring habitats. We want to find the best solutions that, where possible, deliver for people, heritage and biodiversity, as well as for the climate. Leading biodiversity and climate experts agree that climate change and biodiversity loss are interconnected, and the twin crises must be tackled together. The recent Nature Positive 2030 report, prepared by the UK's 5 environmental agencies, also states that we need to go high nature and low carbon. We need to tackle both crises, or we will tackle neither. Restoring the natural environment has a key role to play in climate change mitigation and adaptation. For example, in addition to increasing carbon capture, the restoration of peatlands and woodlands will help improve biodiversity through habitat creation and will provide better natural flood management in a changing climate. Blue carbon solutions, such as the creation of salt marsh, will contribute to coastal adaptation whilst sequestering carbon and providing valuable habitat. Measures taken to reduce carbon must avoid doing further harm to our environment and, where possible, should prioritise nature-based solutions. The Scottish climate legislation includes a duty to take account of the likely impacts of targets on conservation and enhancement of biodiversity, and the new climate legislation in the Republic of Ireland includes a clause underlining the importance of high-quality nature-based solutions to address the climate and nature crisis in tandem. We believe the bill should be amended to reflect the need to tackle the nature and climate crisis together, with an explicit mention of nature-based solutions. If a requirement for climate action plans is added to the bill, as we've suggested, that clause should include provisions to ensure that the plans make use of nature-based solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sophie? Okay. I'll just go straight round for questions. Rosemary Barton, can you hear me? You indicate you want to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you to the various contributors. I've listened to each one of you. You certainly have a lot of concerns about this climate bill number 2, and you've all expressed them very well. Can you give me something positive? Nobody has said in your presentation, you know, you've told us exactly what your problems are with it, but you have give very little indication of what you see positive about climate bill number 2. So can I ask each of you to give me something positive about climate bill number 2?
So you want to pick up on that there?
Hi, yes. Can you hear me? I suppose I should have a go up. We would suggest that the positives of the bill, carbon budgeting mechanism is okay, but we would suggest that it needs a nitrogen budgeting mechanism to complement it as well. I mean, in general terms, I would suggest that this legislation is okay for about 5 years ago. And we need something much more sophisticated, given our position as a climate laggard. We don't want to perpetuate that by bringing in standard legislation, which was applicable and useful 5 years ago, when that legislation has been amended and built upon by comparative jurisdictions. You know, we have a different starting point now. And I think that's something that we really need to explore further.
Okay. Laura, or indeed any of your contributors, most of you mentioned about the just transition, the importance of just transition to be enshrined in the bill. And indeed, this was something we picked up on earlier when we were speaking to the promoters of the first bill. What shape do you think that could take in this bill? Anyone?
I'm happy to answer that one unless anybody else wants to. I mean, this is a kind of a virtue of us being late to bring climate change legislation, in that we can see what forms a just transition has taken within comparative legislation. So in terms of neighbouring jurisdictions, Scotland has been very clear about what a just transition means, and it's set it out very clearly. So we have that precedent and precedents like that to establish. I mean, the fact that it's not in Climate Bill number 2 at all is a major oversight, given that there is so much literature out there about its importance in climate adaptation and mitigation. So, I mean, I would suggest that the Scottish example is probably a very good one to follow, and it's very clear, and that we should even consider elaborating more on that to sort of reflect NI's unique circumstances. I mean, it could be something which is like a theoretical application of what a just transition means and who it applies to, or it could be something very material in terms of a fund or something, or it could be both. But I think to not have any reference to it at all is a major oversight.
Declan?
Sorry, Rosemary. Yeah, Rosemary, go ahead.
I'd like to hear from the other contributors something positive. Thank you. On Climate Bill 2.
I can give you something positive for the adaptation side of things. It's good that this bill has included it. It's good that it's also going to independent review in terms of the climate adaptation plan, because that doesn't currently happen. So that would be something that I would say is an improvement on where we're at right now.
I would just add to that I think the carbon budgeting side of things is reasonably strong, and the climate adaptation stuff is covering quite a bit of detail in the bill, and I think the technical drafting is reasonably strong, as well as the structure of the bill. But as we've sort of pointed out, there's a number of areas where it can be strengthened in terms of ambition, and things like the climate adaptation side of things could be strengthened through inclusion of something around nature-based solutions, just as one example. But there are some strengths in terms of the technical detail and the structure of the bill, but it comes down to ambition and the urgency of the situation we face.
So in other words, you say it comes down to ambition. So it's really the 2045. You're all looking for 2050 zero carbon or 2045 zero.
Yeah,
that seems to be what you're looking for. Have you considered the agricultural community? For example, we're reading in the press at the moment, a lot of you referred to the Republic of Ireland and the climate bill change and what was on it. And yet, when you read the press, we're looking at the discontent among the agricultural community in the South, how they're protesting at the moment in the various towns around the countryside. We don't want to see a situation like that in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, just to confirm, Rosemary, in terms of the ambition that I was referring to, it's in terms of a net zero target enshrined in law. It's removing that power to amend targets downwards so that they can only be revised upwards or become more ambitious. It's having the independent oversight in terms of the governance. It's including stuff around just transition, including stuff around nature-based solutions. And I suppose in terms of agriculture, this is a great opportunity, a great moment in time where we've moved out, I suppose, of the European Union. There's going to be an opportunity now to repurpose what we do with agricultural subsidy. And we still want to see £300 million a year going to the agricultural community, but we can repurpose that and deliver more for climate and for nature. So we've got a major opportunity in our hands, and I think that's where we need that political leadership. We can't continue with the status quo and business as usual. We need to transition and change, and I think that's where agricultural policy can play a major role in helping us to deliver the low carbon transition in an agriculture context.
One thing I wanted to add is that there's a lot of talk at the moment about the agricultural community in terms of cutting of greenhouse gases and how much that is going to cost them. But there isn't a lot of talk about the need to invest in terms of climate resilience and sort of building that up, because really there's a lot of factors that are going to cost them a lot of money in the future. For example, under a 4-degree scenario, this could cost 10% of present lamb production for Northern Ireland, specific for Northern Ireland, because the increase in heat that we're likely to get is going to increase parasites, for example, the Barber's poleworm. So there's lots of very specific examples that we haven't yet properly costed for Northern Ireland. The soil, in terms of that, it's costing well. They've costed it there for 40 million a year, unless we build in the adaptation side of things. So we need to take into account the cost of not doing something, and that this bill should not just be about cutting those greenhouse gases, although that's vitally important. It's also about building in that adaptation side and making sure that we prevent these costs of not doing something in the future as well.
And just to add to that, we know that the farmers are going to be critical to this transition, and we can't tackle climate change without them, given sort of the land mass that they control or manage. So, it's going to require the right mix of investment and support to try and unearth the untapped potential that we have in our farming community, to deliver that low carbon, nature friendly transition. And I think this bill or having ambitious climate legislation is going to be the key driver to actually realise that.
I'm not against ambitious climate targets, not at all. Look, I represent a rural area in the west in Fermanagh South Tyrone, and a lot of my constituents are from the farming background, and they're not against ambitious climate targets, but they need to be considered, and what they can achieve needs to be considered, and the financial consequences of what is being asked, if we're going to have zero carbon by 2050, is going to be, it's going to annihilate part of the economy in Northern Ireland. Or could annihilate part of the economy in Northern Ireland, and that there is something I think that needs to be considered.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it has to
Sorry, yeah. I was just going to say, principally, that's why we feel that just transition needs to be embedded in the climate legislation to ensure that no sector, no community, or no group is left behind. And I think just transition principles, potentially the setting up of a just transition commission like we're seeing in Scotland, and an adequate fund to enable a just transition, those are the mechanisms that need to be put in place to ensure that no sector like agriculture is left behind.
And if I might just follow up on that, I think the problem is there are assumptions built into the kind of predictions of the destruction of the agricultural sector. The assumptions here are that the agricultural sector will continue with the current model with some tweaking. So we'll change foodstuffs or feedstuffs a bit, or they'll maybe change some operating thing, or change the kind of the particular bit of machinery they use to spread slurry or something like this. But it needs to be much more fundamental than that. There is a fundamental problem with the way we're producing food at the moment. And in fact, there's a fundamental problem with pretty much every aspect of our economy and the way we structure our communities. So there needs to be radical reform across the board, including in agriculture. And the principle of a just transition, which we would say needs to be embedded in any legislation, would mean that we don't simply abandon agricultural communities, rural communities, but we put in policies and measures to ensure that they don't get left behind. So, for example, we have a farming model that is driven towards growth, export, driving up profits. We simply can't continue in that way. What we should do is recognise some core fundamental services, perhaps, that agricultural communities, rural communities provide. Growing food is one of them, but also looking after the land is another one. So we should recognise that, and we should pay farmers to look after the land. There's absolutely a basic job that they do is looking after the land for everybody, looking after the environment for everybody. And we should recognise that. We should also recognise that the current industrial model isn't good for rural communities. So, for example, the Going for Growth strategy, one of the authors came out and said, all we need are 6,000 farms. Now, the Ulster Farmers Union immediately came back to say, no, we're going to distance ourselves from that. But that is the natural outcome, the inevitable outcome of the model that we're following at the moment. So what we would suggest is we have a different model, one that nurtures and supports rural communities, that allows for a diversification of income streams, that allows for farmers to be recognised as actual custodians of the land. We say they're custodians of the land, but we don't actually treat them as custodians of the land. So let's treat them as such. Pay them for that vital job that they do, not just producing food, but protecting the environment for everybody else.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, members, I'm just checking my WhatsApp facility here to make sure that there's any other members who are trying to speak. Okay. Well, members, I'd just like to thank you very much for attending here this afternoon. And giving you evidence, and obviously on this particular bill, it's been very helpful, informative, and very detailed. I'm taking loads of notes here, which will give me good food for thought. I suppose one of the things that I will say before I just sign off here, in the responses to the consultation, there was quite a in around 90% of the respondents indicated they would support and recognise the importance of having a transboundary element. What would be your views on the importance of a transboundary element in this bill, given the fact that nature and our climate knows no boundaries?
I can come in there because I'm working on a transboundary project of the best practice in the South at the moment and the rest of the UK as well. So there are gaps at the moment, basically. Obviously, we share both sort of our water, and there isn't currently a groundwater sharing agreement, for example. So there's that needs to go in. There needs to be sort of a bit more cohesiveness between what the policies are in the South and the North, especially, in terms of where we share things. So it's bringing that into the bill, and making sure it's recognised that these things will be strengthened as such within it.
Yeah, and one of the other things that was highlighted as well, the importance of more better preparedness amongst different sectors. What would be your views on that there, or in terms of achieving that? Sectoral planning?
Well, you need climate action plans across all the sectors. I mean, if you look across to GB, just recently there's one from the prison service, there's one from schools. We're not even at the stage of considering that. At the moment, we're thinking a lot about agriculture, and that's vital, but it's every sector needs to be thinking about that. And that's why the reporting power is important, because it gets people thinking. Everyone from our digital and our IT and electrics, that's both adaptation and mitigation. Those climate action plans are vital and need to be in that bill.
And I think there's something, could I maybe just add, because again, in response to what Rosemary was asking, what's good about the bill, at least there is in the legislation that regard across all public bodies and across each of the departments. So that's really, really going to be crucial here. And I think the thing is then, how do you make that happen, which is back to the climate action plans, and how do you bring that into the councils and into other public bodies, arm's length bodies? So I think that's something would be really helpful to have in the bill, to see how that is going to be transferred and deferred, and how we maybe look at incentives within the wider sector and industry to embrace this. So it is now one of the things that people are talking about, but it's how do we create action and how do we measure that going forward? But I think this is a great opportunity. So in terms of having legislation, it's absolutely crucial for Northern Ireland to have at least one bill that takes us forward on climate change.
Well, folks, that's brilliant, and I say we're looking at the whole both bills at the moment. We're looking at the amendments as well to the committee. But I want to just take the opportunity to thank you, Jade, Jonathan, Daithi, Declan, Laura, Malachy, Heather, Sophie, and Victoria. And I apologise if I missed anybody. But I want to thank you very much for coming here this afternoon and giving us the benefit of your widespread knowledge and your views to help us with the scrutiny process. Okay, members. Okay. Thank you very much now.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All the best now. Take care now. Okay, members. The next meeting will take place on Thursday, the 4th of November at 10 a.m. and there'll be hybrid meetings streamed online on the Assembly website. So I'm going to adjourn here now, members. Okay. Thank you, folks. Take care. Bye now. Okay.